650 students from 30 plus law schools across Maharashtra. And I would like to tell you, we could not fit all of them here, so we have another auditorium in the same premises where we are broadcasting this live with 300 more students. And the best part, we did not have to open registrations for this. It was by invite only, and we filled up in day one. So, and this is the magic of two people. And for the very first time on stage together, Dr. Shashi Tharoor and His Justice, Dr. D.Y. Chandrachud. With your permission, if I may start. I want to start this with how you start our living constitution. You cite Dr. Ambedkar's warning. However good a constitution may be, if those who are implementing it are not good, it will prove to be bad. You've also referred to the 1975 emergency as a dark period in your book. Would you classify this as an example of what Dr. Ambedkar was warning us against?
I think his warning is timeless. It can't be restricted to any one particular event. But I will say that the peculiar thing about the 75 to 77 emergency was that it actually was within the letter of the Constitution, but against its spirit. It was constitutional, but undemocratic. And since democracy was so deeply embedded in the spirit of the Constitution, it violated that spirit. So in a sense, what Ambedkar was warning us is you might be able to uphold the letter of the law and completely betray what the law was intended to achieve. In all fairness, Mrs. Gandhi then held an election under the Constitution and with all the freedoms that the Constitution provided, and then proceeded to lose it. So in all fairness again, she stuck in the end, or she returned in the end to the spirit of the Constitution. But the emergency itself, I would agree, was not, despite not being unconstitutional, was not democratic.
Absolutely. And today, some may feel that the current establishment is misusing powers in subtler but equally dangerous. Would you say it's true or a bit of an exaggeration?
No, look, I mean, there's an argument that many political parties in the opposition have made that we're living through an undeclared emergency. And then the BJP side would promptly turn around and say, well, you're able to say this during the emergency, you couldn't have been thrown in jail if you said that. So, it then becomes haggling over what is the definition of an undeclared emergency and so on. So I prefer not to use terms loosely. I've always been very reluctant to stick a label on something unless the label in itself conveys exactly what I wanted to convey. And very often, I'm afraid, words are fraught with meanings, with associations, with historical baggage. So I prefer not to address it in that. I've talked about the fact that in many ways, a lot of the decisions that we have seen taken by the current government have involved, in some ways, a hollowing out of our institutions and our processes and our constitutional principles. They're all standing. The Constitution has not directly been violated, or Justice Chandrachud would have pointed it out. But at the same time, it hasn't, in every case, I think, been adhered to in principle. And so, how do we ensure, as Dr. Ambedkar wanted us to, that the operation of the Constitution is done in as good a way as he would have liked? When he introduced this whole concept of constitutional morality into our discourse, it hadn't been raised in the Indian political or judicial space until he brought it in. It was, I think, fair to say, a fairly relatively obscure idea that Roth had come up with in Europe. But Ambedkar brought it in, and he applied it very specifically because he had, as you know, a lot of concerns about what he called the top dressing of a liberal constitution on essentially undemocratic soil. Because as a Dalit, he felt that our society was not democratic, but we were giving a democratic constitution to a society which, because it was inherently undemocratic, might apply the constitution without the moral content that he wanted it to have. So for him, it was very important that we acquire constitutional morality, and that meant that the spirit of the Constitution had to be practiced throughout society. As you know, he said some perhaps slightly intemperate things before his death against the workings of the Constitution. that he had himself been the progenitor of. But for him, you could have a bad constitution that could be made great by good people, and you could have a good constitution made bad by bad people. And so we must constantly be on guard. It's a vigilance that we have to all show all the time.
And be cautious with our words, and it's coming from the wonderland of words himself. So now coming to Justice, when sweeping mandates are secured, many fear that there is a risk of constitutional distortion. And they say this because increasingly there are a number of judges assuming public offices post-retirement. How do you respond to growing concerns about the judiciary's independence and public perception of its neutrality?
Anjali, there is a premise underlying your question, which is that the Constitution would thrive and be strong when you have a fractured majority in the governance at the center. And I question that assumption. The Constitution was not intended to be a document or an instrument which would thrive when you have a politically fractured majority in governance. It's a constitution for all times, for all seasons. You may have a strong party which is ruling the government, either in the center or the states. You may have a coalition. You may have a variety of political configurations. But nonetheless, the Constitution was intended to govern equally well, independent of what political confabulations or configurations you have in different states or in the center. Coming to the question now which you pose on the basis of the premise, which is of a number of judges accepting post-retirement offices, and does that impact on judicial independence? There's a host of parliamentary legislation which contemplates that you will have retired judges to man those specialized tribunals. Because increasingly across the democratic world, specialized tribunals have been constituted. So just to give you a few examples, you have the Appellate Tribunal for Electricity. Here in Mumbai, the Securities Appellate Tribunal. You have the Central Administrative Tribunal, the Armed Forces Tribunal, the National Green Tribunal, the National Consumer Disputes Redressal Tribunal, the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal, and the Tribunal, which is hearing all the cases under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now, in all these tribunals, the underlying legislation, or the ITAT, the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, which is not a new creation, it's a creation of several decades ago. All these pieces of parliamentary legislation contemplate that a former judge, a former Chief Justice of the High Court, or a judge of the Supreme Court would head the tribunal. So if you didn't have former judges accepting these judicial offices, which incidentally Parliament has created, you would not be able to man these specialized tribunals in the first place. Now, the reality, Anjali, is very different from what your question portrays it. And I can share with you this experience which I had as a Chief Justice, which is that it is increasingly difficult to have judges accept office to these tribunals. Possibly it's because of the environment which the media has created, that any judge who accepts office in an administrative tribunal or in the Armed Forces Tribunal has been given some sort of political favor. As a Chief Justice, you have to actually pursue judges, because we need people of integrity. We need people of competence to man these highly specialized tribunals in new areas of economic and regulatory governance, like the Appellate Tribunal for Electricity. Every dispute is dealing with thousands of crores, and the most complex issues of deregulation of the electricity sector, of Securities Appellate Tribunal, which sits just around the corner at Nariman Point, on which depends the stability of our stock market. So you require people, men and women of integrity, to head these tribunals. And therefore, Parliament has contemplated that there would be judges who would be occupying these offices. And that's part of the policy of an elected body which represents the whole nation in the legislature. Coming away from these specialized tribunals, the question as to whether former judges should hold political office, contest elections, for instance. We've had examples in the past. One of our most distinguished judges, Justice Subbarao, resigned from the Supreme Court to contest the presidential election.
Which he lost.
Which he lost. Now, Indian democracy, or the judicial independence of our judges, has not been damaged by these examples. So it's ultimately a question of everyone's conscience. And what keeps judicial independence afloat is something much more fundamental. And that's a combination. It's a combination of the constitutional environment, active citizens' participation in the adjudicatory process, the critique of an independent media, civil society, which is constantly keeping a watch on how judges behave and perform. So it's not that simple, but the difficulty lies when we create this hype around anybody who accepts post-retirement office that somehow this must be wrong, which means that we are actually ensuring that a lot fewer judges are willing to accept that office. Part of the reason is that, after spending 20 years on the bench, you don't want to get back into judicial office. You want to be a free citizen, as I am today. But, so it's not as simple as that, having a direct correlation.
But would you agree that there is a distinction between accepting an office that is meant for, even reserved for, former judges, like all the examples you cited, and accepting, say, a Rajya Sabha seat or a governorship, which are not only for judges? And some of the judges who've done that,
no. We've had some exceptional individuals who've occupied those offices as well. People who have done remarkably well in those offices. In fact, I believe to the contrary, that there's a great deal of experience which judges can bring to, say, the legislative bodies. I think I appeared before the Joint Parliamentary Committee just 2 weeks ago on the One Nation, One Election constitutional amendment which is proposed. I was requested by the chairperson to make my presentation. I said, well, this is the first time in my life I'm going to be doing that. But I felt that I learned such a great deal from interacting with our parliamentarians and realized that, across party lines, the work which is done in parliamentary committees is such a high constitutional order, where people have forgotten to that moment, the party divisions. They are talking about pure constitutional doctrine. Likewise, I believe that there is an inadequate sense of understanding about the true nature of the judicial function, the challenges which face our judiciary. And therefore, these watertight divisions between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, which must hold so long as you are in office, are not as watertight, or shouldn't be as watertight. They're not as watertight in other parts of the world. We know that they're not as watertight in the United States. I'm not sure whether that's a better system or not. It's ultimately a matter of individual conscience as well. But I, for one, feel that we shouldn't be laying down absolute boundaries, because the absolute boundaries which we tend to lay down are not valid in constitutional theory, and they don't make good for good constitutional practice as well. I mean, coming back to the Constitution, it's such a visionary document. Why did the founding parents, the fathers and mothers, the 15 members of the Constituent Assembly who were women, as you referred to in the book, why is it that they didn't pose a disqualification on former judges entering into legislative office? And that was for a reason. They imposed other disqualification, but not this one. So I don't believe in drawing absolute or rigid boundaries. I think life is much more fluid, and we should allow it to remain that way.
And with people like yourself who are at the helm safeguarding this pillar of democracy, I think we are good. But moving on to my next question, which I think our Gen Z and millennial audience are very passionate about, freedom of speech and expression. Your Lordship, Article 19(1)(a) guarantees free speech with reasonable restrictions. Yet time and again we've seen comedians are jailed before performing, creators face FIRs for satire, and this happens while elected leaders make inappropriate remarks, be it communal or otherwise. They are let go without consequence. How does the judiciary address what many feel is an uneven application of free speech? Do you think sometimes those in power seem to be protected and those dissenting are penalized?
Well, I for one believe that, free speech is at the core of constitutional liberty. And the ability of people to speak, to dissent, to express a voice which is away from the mainstream, as also within the mainstream, is at the core of the functioning of a democratic polity. The ultimate protector of free speech is not just the judiciary or the law, it's also civil society. But the judiciary and the rule of law have a vital element, are a vital element in the protection of free speech. What is of concern to me today is the unwillingness of our trial judiciary particularly to be liberal in the grant of bail in matters particularly concerning free speech. A person, even a day's incarceration as an under trial, if it's wrong, is a day too long. Even an hour is an hour too long because it has a chilling effect on what others perceive can happen to them if they speak something which is, frowned upon by speaking truth to power. Therefore, particularly because the trial courts have the first interface with our citizens, it's the trial courts which have to be strengthened in their ability to grant bail. What is now happening is this, that matters which should end in the trial court granting bail move to the high courts, matters which should end with the high court granting bail move to the Supreme Court, as a result of which there's a real danger that the system is becoming dysfunctional. Because by the time a case reaches the Supreme Court, several weeks or maybe several months have passed away. And then what happens if the Supreme Court grants bail in a case where the trial court should have granted bail in the first case? And therefore the presumption that, bail should be the rule and jail should be the exception, particularly in matters involving, core political rights like free speech, must necessarily govern. But we live, unfortunately, today in a culture of distrust about public institutions. And I dare say that judges, particularly at the trial level, are sometimes fearful of whether the grant of bail would be misunderstood as being motivated by some improper consideration. We have to protect our judges. Even if a judge was wrong in the grant of bail, that judge should be protected. There's obviously a remedy, a higher remedy. You may set aside an order which is wrong. But then to, castigate a judge or bring a sort of a moral disincentive to a judge who's granting bail is unfortunate. And that's what has happened. But there's a general culture of distrust of all public institutions. And this is part of the reason for where we find that we are today. But this is certainly a matter of concern.
Dr. Tharoor, I'd like to ask you the other side of it. You've engaged with a lot of young people at IIMUN as well. We engage with impressionable young minds, which are usually below 19. This is an exception audience today, which we're very happy to organize as well. But these young people consume vast amounts of content online. Do you think that the government should protect them from harmful, polarizing, and inappropriate content, or do you think it should be left at individual discretion?
Well, I think the problem with asking the government to control what people can consume by way of information is that the government may have an agenda different from what you intend when you propose such a thing. So I prefer to keep the government's hands off any kind of information flow. The question of then who should control or whether it should be controlled at all, I think is up to the individual and the individual's family. I mean, there are families where, children's time on the net is rationed, where they're told they can only go on the internet for an hour a day or whatever it may be. There are others where some are not allowed to have a mobile phone or access to one until they reach a certain age. So there are various ways in which this could be regulated short of getting the government involved. I'm actually a bit nervous about getting governments involved. Governments have political agendas, any government, and governments obviously have points of view, which means that in the guise of restricting something that's harmful, they can also restrict things they don't like. And then whose morality comes into play? It's a politician's, not that of any civil society standard or family standard or even judicial standard. So I'd rather keep the government out of this business. It's not easy. I mean, I know that many people feel that complete lack of regulation can be dangerous. But I think that if you give regulation to the wrong people, that can be more dangerous, and that becomes an issue. I'd like to briefly turn to what Justice Chandrachud said earlier about this question of people having to spend weeks, often going through 3 levels of the judiciary in order to get bail, which they should have got in the first instance. He's totally right, of course. But very often the prosecution intends not to convict the person, but just to harass the person through this kind of. The process is the punishment. If somebody is charged with some trivial offense and the trial judge doesn't have the courage to give him or her bail, and then this keeps on dragging out, in the meantime, the person is sitting in jail for weeks, months, losing income, losing livelihood, losing their sanity, losing their freedom, and at the end of it, they're let off anyway, which they should have been. That becomes a real problem. And in many ways, I think the misuse of the judiciary that worries me very much is this entire question of the process. There are so many inefficiencies in our system. There are trivial cases that judges should have thrown out in the very first hearing, which are admitted and which drag on for ages. I mean, I remember when I first came into politics, and some people didn't like that, I was actually sued for having put my hand on my heart during the singing of the national anthem, as apparently a violation of the 1971 Respective National Honor Act or some such thing. And this dragged on for 4 years, cost me by then a small fortune in legal fees and so on. At the end of which, when we finally went to the High Court said, putting your hand on your heart is an act of respect, where is it disrespect, and threw it out. But we had gone through 4 years and innumerable hearings, including hearings in which the complainant didn't show up, and still the court case was just adjourned instead of being thrown out. And I kept asking myself, why do we allow this to happen? Why are we doing this to ourselves, wasting so much time? The first time in my life I stood in a dock as a charged person for this offense. I felt awful. And I felt, my God, this is what they mean. You know, this is the way of exacting conformity. Anyway, I mean, I do feel that the fact that the process is the punishment is something that ordinary people have to worry about with our judiciary.
Absolutely. And keeping government away from regulating the content we consume, I think perhaps at this day and age would be a smart idea. But moving on to our next topic is on reservations, where Dr. Tharoor, you note how reservations originally envisioned by Dr. Ambedkar, and as you quote, were a temporary corrective, but today have become politically untouchable. I'm from GLC myself, and 50%, more than 50% of seats are reserved, and we work with this IIMUN's network with so many young people. We hear this quite often, and there is a growing concern that merit is often being compromised in the names of reservation. Do you believe India can ever move beyond reservations, or are they too entrenched in vote bank politics?
I think they're very, very entrenched. In fact, the irony is a lot of the founding fathers were against reservations, including Mr. Nehru, who's written about it in letters to chief ministers, saying why he's opposed to reservations. There's even a debatable proposition, I don't want to get into it, about whether Dr. Ambedkar wanted at the end of 10 years the reservations to continue or not. But the fact of the matter is they're here to stay. In America, I don't know how many of you have knowledge of this, but the American subway system, the underground subway system in America, has 3 rails. There are 2 rails on which the train runs. And in between there is a 3rd rail, which generates the electricity on which the train runs. Now, if you accidentally touch the 3rd rail, you're instantly electrocuted. Reservations are the 3rd rail of Indian politics. No politician is going to dare to touch them because he's instantly fried. So the result is, very, very seriously, that whatever intellectual disagreements and discussions you may have, when even sort of the great-grandson of Mr. Nehru is a major advocate of reservations in our politics today, I think those who may have intellectual difficulties with this notion will have to sit back and say, this we can't touch, we have to work within it and try and ensure the promotion of merit within. I mean, I've been advocating for a long time, for example, that many of the sort of underprivileged communities, underprivileged by either class or caste or gender or religion, should actually be getting also another kind of affirmative action. Extra courses, remedial instruction, a leg up, extra coaching, for example, on how to take examinations. How you can get, for example, people into the police, into the army, into in fact, even the central services, by encouraging them to be able to take advantage of the opportunities available to them through merit. So even within reservations, it's possible to promote merit, but you need to encourage it because a lot of people need that extra help.
Your Lordship Justice, what is your advice to the government on going about this? Has the time come to reevaluate the structure and scope of reservations, not to weaken affirmative action, but to ensure it remains fair and relevant?
I have a slightly different take on the previous question as well as this one. On the regulation of the content of the internet, I'll just take less than 20 seconds on that. I still believe that there are some lines which we have to draw on the regulation of the internet and the content of the internet. Obviously, political speech should not be regulated. But what about child pornography?
Well, that's against the law already.
You know, so should there be no regulatory framework for regulating, say, child pornography or the depiction of gendered violence, where you sort of bring down the dignity of a woman by the depiction of violence against
But
women?
those are all against the law. So what's against the law, no one's...
Right. But what is against the law is still freely available on the internet. So in which case, should we not, as a nation, really arrive at some consensus that these are boundaries which no one can cross? Don't depict child pornography. Don't depict any scene which involves violence against a woman, physical violence or emotional or mental violence, because otherwise this will become the new normal in our society. That's my little point on this. On this second aspect, on reservations, which was really your question, reservations were introduced in India in the backdrop of centuries of discrimination against the marginalized groups in our society, who did not, by the way, constitute a minority, but constitute the majority of the country. That's the difference, say, between India and the US. Now, the idea, therefore, was through reservations and affirmative action to mainstream them into Indian public life, in Indian social life. The Constitution itself was not just an instrument for the transfer of political power from a colonial to an independent Indian regime, but an instrument of social transformation. So there were two parallel movements which were going on when the Constitution was drafted. And reservations in that sense proceed on the postulate that you can have a stable polity, you can have a stable society when all elements of the society, including those who have been historically discriminated against for centuries, are brought into the mainstream of discourse. Now, we have to ask ourselves this question. Can we say today, 75 years after the Constitution has been adopted, that discrimination against, say, the marginalized communities, the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes in particular, has ended after 75 years? And the answer to that would be clearly in the negative. You still have students who commit suicide, Dalit students who have committed suicide in the IITs or in different institutions. So which means that the time where you can say that discrimination against the scheduled castes has ended has still not arrived in India. India still faces that. Having said that, judicially, there has been a number of very innovative approaches to reservation. One of the decisions which we rendered as part of the Constitution bench was on this issue of subclassification. Can a state government subclassify the scheduled castes which are notified by Parliament or the President, as the case may be, so as to confine or give benefits to the most backward amongst them? The Supreme Court said yes. There's nothing in the Constitution which should prevent a state government from identifying those castes which are truly backward and then ensuring that benefits go to them, so that the benefits are not really absorbed by the most forward amongst the backward communities. So we've permitted that. The other reservation in India is for the socially and educationally backward classes of citizens, the OBCs as we call them. That's how the Constitution calls them. Now, we've applied the creamy layer doctrine to reservations for the socially and educationally backward classes of citizens, which means that the most affluent amongst the socially and educationally backward classes of citizens are excluded from the benefit of reservations. The final point which I want to make on this, of course, you can spend a whole afternoon discussing this, is on what do you really mean by merit? Does merit mean, for instance, the scores which you clock on the NEET, National Eligibility Exam Entrance Test for medical admissions, or in the CLAT, the common law aptitude test. You know, the reason why merit cannot be reflected in the scores which you have on these, the raw scores in these tests, is that the raw scores which students attain in these tests are themselves the product of your cultural and social capital. You know, the best students the students who generally score the best are those who have access to coaching classes, who have command over English. There are, of course, exceptions to this. But therefore, if you define merit not in terms of your ability to score in examinations, but merit in terms of inclusion, of the ability of our society to give responsible positions in governance to different segments of society, that is what defines merit, then reservations are not contrary to merit, but they in fact further merit, because it allows for people, whether they become IAS officers, whether they become IPS officers, doctors, an equal share of social development. Otherwise, you know, what is happening even today, Anjani, is this, that if you look at the representation of the scheduled caste, for instance, you will find a lot of representation or improved representation at the lowest levels, class 4 posts. When you come to the top posts, the most important positions of responsibility, you will find them lacking even today. The same thing in the case of women, for instance. Now, where do you find... So therefore, I think, you know, of course, Dr. Ambedkar believed that, you know, reservations initially should be valid for 10 years. But I do believe that for India to maintain the sense of social harmony, the social equilibrium, and I see the flip side, as you said in the law college, 50% of the seats are reserved. And I see the flip side from the point of view of a person belonging to a non-reserved community. But looking at it from an overall national perspective, I still do believe that reservations in India have been a very potent source of maintaining this social equilibrium, where we brought all segments of the community and given them an opportunity for personal growth and development and social growth and development as well.
I agree with all that. Can I just ask you a question, Dhananjay, on a very important aspect of this? In 2015, Justices Gogoi and Nariman, neither of them was a Chief Justice at the time, came up with a judgment on the Jat reservation case, where they actually declared that birth into a particular category would no longer be sufficient for the Supreme Court to permit reservations, and they wanted the government to come back with a matrix of disabilities that were entitled a person to reservations. Now, curiously, Gogoi went on to become a CJI, never referred to his own judgment again. I believe he was the principal author of it. And subsequently, of course, Nariman had a distinguished career. You've had reservation-related cases coming before you. I've never seen another reference to this argument that, and the government has never come up with a matrix anyway, that you could actually make reservations and merit and all of these things something that is subject to a greater set of considerations than mere birth into a caste or a community alone. That you would have, let's say, you could have points for being a single mother, earning a certain level of income, being from a certain caste or community, being whatever, all of those things. And then, depending on that, you would qualify or not for reservation. That's what I understood by the language of that judgment. I'm just curious, whatever happened to that thinking?
You know, the moment you talk about these other metrics, then you are substituting the very foundation of the reservation policy in India. Which is, no, it is not necessarily good. Now, we have reservations under the EWS category, the economically weaker sections, where you apply a pure economic criteria. Mm-hmm. But you can't really subsume reservations only under the economically weaker sections category. Because in some communities, birth within that community is itself a source of discrimination. Even in the India today, if you go to the villages, birth within that caste or community is a very potent source of discrimination. Now, what the government has done, which is by bringing in the recent constitutional amendment, is to also allow for reservations to the EWS category, which is really to say that in the non-reserved categories, namely the non-SC, ST, OBC categories as well, there may be people who would be economically underprivileged and who should also be given a certain degree of reservation, which is a different basis altogether of reservation. But to apply that criterion to castes which are fundamentally underprivileged would really take away the whole social basis of the reservation policy. And I still do believe that India has not still come to that point where we can say that, well, all communities are equally, or all castes are equally situated, and therefore we can end reservation. I don't think India has come to that level at all as yet.
Like you said, sir, we could go on for a few more hours on this topic. So, moving on to another question which our Constituent Assembly wanted us to address, which is Uniform Civil Code. Justice from Shah Bano to Sarla Mudgal, the Supreme Court has consistently upheld the importance of a uniform civil code as essential for gender justice and national integration. Yet in 2025, UCC remains unimplemented. Do you believe, first, do you think India needs a UCC today? And if so, what continues to hold back its realization?
The Constitution gives us an answer. The Constitution speaks about the desirability of a uniform civil code. It's part of the directive principles of state policy, therefore not capable of being enforced as a fundamental right by any citizen, but yet a powerful statement of a constitutional goal. 75 years have elapsed. Is 75 years not adequate enough for us to achieve a constitutional goal? I think we have to achieve the constitutional goal. I'll give you a very simple example. Why should, for instance, the religion or the community to which a woman belongs, I'm giving you an example from the point of view of gender, all right? And this is not universal, but just as an example. Why should the fact that a woman belongs to a woman for whom succession opens up because, say, a father or mother has died, or a spouse has died, why should the nature of succession or the extent of succession rights be dependent on which religion she belongs to? For a woman, for instance, who is left destitute, or even not destitute, just in terms of her rights to succession, why should it be dependent on what religion she professes? We live under the rubric of one nation, and at least in matters of succession, it's time that the country made the first step forward to ensure that irrespective of what religion you belong to, these are essential matters where we are Indians. Now, to speak of a uniform civil code is not to deny that every community or every religious community is entitled to their own forms of ritual for, say, marriage ceremonies. Not at all. If you belong to community A and you have to take the Saptapadi, fine. If you belong to another community and there are different forms of religious ritual for marriage, that's fine. These are all cultural traditions which are obviously very vital to a plural India, to an inclusive and diverse India. But in matters such as adoption of children, if a single woman wants to adopt a child, why should her right to adopt a child be dependent on what community she belongs to? As I gave you the example of succession. So obviously we have to make this step forward now in terms of having a UCC. Having said that, I think it's important for our legislators to take the community into confidence. By community, I mean the wider society. For instance, tribal issues. There has to be a greater degree of confidence that this is not going to affect tribal custom, which it will not, where there exists tribal custom, because India is diverse. So we need to have a very rational conversation across the board, take diverse elements of our community into confidence, and say that this is ultimately not merely something which we need to do to foster the idea of one India, but also as a matter of justice to different segments of our society. But there should be this element of confidence building, which I think is crucial, because that's part of the political process in a democratic polity.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that. What even Nehruji said was that, uniform civil code is desirable, but you've got to take everybody along. You can't impose it on anybody. The problem has been that, of course, when you don't want to impose it on everybody, you are essentially giving a veto very often to the most retrogressive elements in each community, who, for example, would want to deny women certain rights in those communities, and therefore they resist a UCC. So you've got to have a conscious effort at a persuasive exercise. The other thing is being absolutely sure of what exactly a UCC is going to contain. One of the frustrations that we've had in the political debates on the UCC is no one has shown us a draft law. Now we're finding Uttarakhand coming up with a UCC, but that contains some pretty preposterous requirements like live-in couples having to register and all sorts of things which certainly were never part of any civil code anywhere and suddenly have come into Uttarakhand where it was not a requirement of the past. What is that supposed to mean? Are we going to try and make that a national thing? I mean, I get the impression more and more that in the absence of clarity of an agreed draft code that would actually be a product of a widespread consultation with all communities, that this is going to go nowhere. It's not because everything the Justice says is correct. I think obviously the main issues, the contentious ones, are going to be marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption. I mean, these are the areas in which personal laws are held very close by many communities, and they don't want to abrogate the practices of those communities in these areas. But if a UCC is going to venture well beyond that and come up with all these other provisions, then many of us may not agree with some of those elements of the UCC or otherwise in favor of a UCC. You see what I'm saying? So we need to know what will a UCC contain, who loses out, who gains, what will be abolished, what of current practices will no longer be possible, what new practices will be required. When that picture is clear, we can have a better informed conversation.
Until then, if I ask you the question, you don't know whether UCC should be implemented today or not.
In principle, it's a desirable idea. I don't think anyone can disagree. After all, most countries in the world have uniform civil code. And even today in India, I mean, if you commit a murder, it doesn't matter what your religion is. If you commit a driving offense, it doesn't matter what your religion is. You have the same punishment as anybody else, right? It's only in these specific areas that your personal law applies and either shields you or disables you.
Absolutely. Now I'd like to take you to another very interesting subject. You've written the chapter on this, an alternative idea of India. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Tharoor, you document how early leaders of the RSS openly rejected the constitution and criticized it for being too rooted in Western ideas rather than Hindu traditions. And they themselves advocated for a Hindu Rashtra. You describe this as part of an alternative idea of India, and yet in your following chapters, you do acknowledge an important shift that has taken place with Mohan Bhagwat, the current chief of RSS, publicly stating that the organization now accepts the constitution. So this is not a small turn. Do you think this is a genuine ideological shift, or do you think it's a strategic accommodation for electoral success?
Yeah, that, the genuineness of anybody's conversion is a matter for individual judgment. To my mind, there seems to be a significant shift. Let me explain that the conceptual disagreement. Yes, I mean, they did talk about it being full of imported Western ideas and written in the wrong language because the original drafting was in English. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was a conceptual debate on what is a nation. So the Constitution defined India as a territory, a physical body of land, and assigned rights to everybody living on that territory who had a claim to citizenship. That was what the Constitution did. Whereas what people like Savarkar, Golwalkar, and other thinkers at that time, all the way up to 20 years after the Constitution was adopted, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, they all said, this is fundamentally flawed as a premise. A nation is not a territory, a nation is a people. And they said the people of India are the Hindu people, and therefore the Constitution should have been written only for the Hindus of India. It should have enshrined a Hindu nation, and it should have made provisions for others to be here as either guests or interlopers or as invitees or whatever, and that was their notion. Now that was very explicitly rejected by the founders of the Constitution, who saw very much the sort of conventional, if you like, idea of Constitution as something that gave everyone rights irrespective of their religion. Now it took a long time for the Hindu Rashtra school of thought to come around to the idea of the constitution. Well, we've seen in the first ever time that the advocates of Hindutva have had a majority in parliament and have come into government, that they have embraced the constitution. The Prime Minister declared it to be his holy book. As you said, Mr. Mohan Bhagwat, the Sarsang Chalak of the RSS, has publicly said that his notion of Hindu Rashtra does not exclude Muslims, for example. And that how people choose to worship and what gods they worship are their business. But what he wants is for them to subscribe to Indianness, which in fact is a fairly significant departure from that conceptual view of Indian nationalism as inhering in the Hindu people. And I think that whole notion of the Hindu people itself was a bit confused at the time. The RSS was founded in 1925 at a time when around the world there were all sorts of ideas of race. And there are references in both Savarkar's and Golwalkar's writing to the Hindu race. The Hindus are not a race. But that was the way people thought in those days about racial purity and the rights of certain races and so on. And they thought in those terms, which now seem completely old-fashioned and discredited. So I do believe there has been a change. In fact, one of the striking things, which I'm not sure I mentioned in the book, I probably haven't, is that the RSS has now issued an expurgated edition of Golwalkar's writings, leaving out some of his more inflammatory pronouncements on these subjects. So suddenly it looks like they are even censoring their past, or reinventing their past, that'd be a fairer way of putting it, in order to justify a different approach in the future. So as far as I'm concerned, the Constitution, if those who fundamentally questioned and challenged it now embrace it and hail it as theirs, then I think we're home and dry. I think the Constitution is for everyone now, and no one is really challenging it anymore. Am I right?
Do you want me to answer the question, or are you going to ask me another question?
I think we can move on to the next part of this, which is quick rapid fire.
I just wanted to add just this. The Constitution, as we look at it today, is not a Constitution which has remained static. It's not a Constitution which exists on the same premises that it did at the birth or the founding moment of the Constitution. The Constitution truly, truly is a Constitution which reflects an Indian ethos. On the one hand, our Constitution places a very great importance on individual autonomy, which is the product of a Western liberal constitutional thought, but equally contemplates restrictions on the autonomy of the individual. The Constitution therefore does recognize that India inheres as much as in the individual as in the community of citizens in which an individual resides, whether it's in the villages, the towns, the intermediate areas, the metropolitan areas, and in the nation ultimately. The Constitution speaks therefore of individual rights, but equally of individual duties which have come into the Constitution. It speaks of areas of local self-governance, like the panchayats. It speaks of the diversity of the nation in terms of the administration of the scheduled areas, the tribal areas. So in that sense, I do believe that though the Constitution, when it was formulated, came into existence in the backdrop of the Government of India Act of 1935, because there had to be some blueprint for governance on the basis of which a new document would emerge. The Constitution has really completely evolved over the last 75 years. And that, I believe, is the sense of stability of the Constitution, that it is able to absorb emerging thoughts, ideas, changing ideas, the challenges which have confronted the nation. The Constitution was predominantly interpreted by the courts to be a unitary constitution in the 1950s and 1960s. Because, there was a fear as to whether India would survive as a nation, a fear which Dr. Ambedkar himself expressed in the Constituent Assembly, particularly in his speech on the 26th of November 1949. Over a period of time, as the polity has matured, as the threat of secession is no longer really in that sense a valid threat, you find that the Constitution has been interpreted to give greater power to the states. So as the polity has evolved, as the state of democracy has evolved, so also the interpretation of the Constitution has evolved. The challenges which we faced during the years of the emergency led to an interpretation of the Constitution which did less service to the letter of the Constitution and more service to the spirit of the Constitution by reading due process into the articles of the Constitution. So I think that, in a sense, really reflects the true stability and the value of the Constitution. The ability to adapt while at the same time maintaining the core principles of democratic governance intact.
Hence, our living constitution.
Exactly.
But that brings me to my first question under this rapid fire section, which is, if the constitution is a living document, how old does it feel to you today? Is it like a wise elder, a struggling adult, or a restless teenager?
Or the third is?
A restless teenager.
I would think a little bit of all of them. You know, a young adult meeting the new challenges of the age of the social media, of the internet, a restless teenager yearning for change, for a better future, and a wise adult which has seen the changing seasons. And so I believe it represents a whole cycle of life.
Very well said. Dr. Tharoor, one constitutional value you think India needs to urgently reclaim?
Reclaim, that implies a value that we have lost. I'm not sure we've lost anything. No? So I think we've done, and thanks to successive judges as well, we've tried to uphold pretty much all that's in the Constitution. So what do we need to reclaim? I'm going to take a pass on that one, because honestly, to reclaim something, you really have to say, we've lost this, we need to get it back. Perhaps the safe answer would be constitutional morality again, to constantly work with the spirit of what was intended by the founders, even as we adjusted to prevailing circumstances, new challenges, and so on. I mean, one thing I'd love to see changing in the working of the Constitution is this blessed judicial pendency. The number of cases piling up in all the levels of the courts is insane. Do you think artificial intelligence can kindly go through all of these blessed things and give us some sort of suggested judgments so we can clear the backlog?
I look for you to answer that,
actually. You want me to answer this one?
Put you on the spot.
I'll tell you an answer to this. I had a case of a student with 88% disability who wanted admission to a medical college in India. That student was rejected for admission by 3 expert committees. If we had given the decision to artificial intelligence, they would have said it's contrary to the law and the student cannot get admission. We said the student has to be admitted. There was a brilliant student from Mumbai who had an 88% disability, and we felt we must give that student a chance at life. So, you know, in that sense, I think human decision making may be imperfect. We are fallible as judges, we are fallible as intellectuals, as lawyers, as citizens, but I would still trust the human element in judging.
So in some cases, your grandchildren will get justice for something you filed today.
Having said that, I mean, there have to be fundamental reforms in the judicial structure. Because even if India is to go into a $10 trillion economy or a $30 trillion economy, the fundamental reforms which are now necessary and the next generation of reforms are in the judicial system. Because unless we have respect for the rule of law, we are not going to have business and investment, which will in that sense flourish and thrive. So critical reforms to the appointment process, the procedural aspects of judicial review, the unnecessary appeals. Unfortunately, you find in Indian courts that people who want to defeat or delay justice can do so without fear of consequences. And I have seen that happen throughout my career as a judge. It's a cause of great concern. I think we have to meet it head on and press for change in the legal and judicial system.
Thank you. Dr. Tharoor, one directive principle you wish could be converted into fundamental right today?
You really should be asking all the judges these questions.
He was happy when I asked you this question.
again, I honestly think the fundamental rights are pretty complete in and of themselves. It's the way in which we implement some of these rights. I mean, I'm troubled, for example, by the marital rape exception. There's an example where the crime of rape, which involves violence, is what ought to be punished, rather than making an exception for who does the rape on the grounds of a marital contract. There are very many cases where separated couples end up with the wife being raped and the husband getting away with it, because the marital rape applies until their person is divorced. Now, there's an example of something which I would like to see the rights reflected, whether it's through the law, whether it's through judicial pronouncements, where honestly, at the moment, politically, no one seems to have the courage in our system to challenge marital rape. It's still an exception. It's still not, it's still excusable under the law. But at some point, we've got to draw the line and say, this isn't about sex or marital rights, it's about violence.
Absolutely. Justice, my next question is for you. If Ambedkar were alive today, what do you think he'd be the most proud of, and what would he be the most disappointed by?
And I have to answer the question, right? Well, I think Dr. Ambedkar would be really proud of the fact that the Constitution is not just being applied in courtrooms, but across the length and breadth of India, in our streets, in our villages, that is being worked on by people as the people's document. I think that he would be really proud of. I think what Dr. Ambedkar would be really disappointed by is the extent of discrimination which still is faced by segments of our society for whom he stood for. When a student at the IIT commits suicide because because of a variety of circumstances, young, innocent, and valuable, productive lives being lost of students who commit suicide, I think he would have been very, very despondent at that kind of discrimination, which still is reality in India.
We do want to invite a few questions from the audience, but the first word that comes to your mind when I say, Dr. Tharoor, Manmohan Singh, the man you dedicated this book to.
You see, he embodied in many ways the spirit of the Constitution. That's why I dedicated it to him, because he was a Democrat to the core, deeply compassionate, so he cared about the people. And at the same time, somebody who had to work the levers of governance and power and law and so on. So that's why I chose to dedicate the book to Dr. Manmohan Singh. When you think in terms of Justice Chandrachud's last answer, that's something that really struck me, because even during the Delhi launch of this book, one of the comments somebody made is very striking, how they'd heard an illiterate woman who obviously couldn't have read the Constitution, citing the Constitution as the basis for her rights to demand something. And that people have now learned, and Justice Tharoor is so right, people have now learned that this book, whether they've read it or not, whether they understand every provision or not, gives them certain rights within India to lay claim to. And I think in many ways that's the great thing. And here is Manmohan Singh, born in a village in Pakistan, a refugee in our country, growing up, sheer hard work, hard studies, scholarships, professional rise, coming up and being the person entrusted with the task of running this Constitution, in the name of and on behalf of people who, unlike him, hadn't risen from the circumstances of their birth, but whose rights also inhere in this document. I think that's what made it so special.
Just as the first thought that comes to your mind when I say one nation, one election.
I've said that before the Joint Parliamentary Committee just a couple of weeks ago. Not violative of the basic structure of the Constitution, but work in progress where the draft amendment can be improved upon.
Same question to you as well.
Yeah, no, my problem with that, I mean, in theory it's fine. We had one nation, one election in 1952, 57, 62, 67. Why don't we have it today? Because we have a parliamentary system and not a presidential one. So If any government loses its majority and falls, election cycles go wonky. And that's why today, why is it that every 6 months there's an election in some state or the other? Because state governments have risen and fallen at different times, whenever they had a government that lost its majority or whatever. And so, and this has also happened at the center, right? Not every central government has finished a full term. And therefore, everything has gone out of sync. I can't understand how you can prevent this from happening and still be democratic. If you want to declare one nation, one election, you squeeze everybody in. First of all, we are bridging some assemblies in order to make them conform to the nation. So you're actually being undemocratic because you're cutting short the terms to which they've been elected. And you're prolonging some others, which is undemocratic because you're giving some assemblies a longer term of office in order to reach the arbitrary date. You do all of that, so you're undemocratic twice over. Then you have an election, and for whatever reason, in one state there's a majority government, in another state there isn't. A coalition partner suddenly pulls out, the government falls. What do? You're going to have presidents rule for the remaining 3.5, 4 years? If so, where's democracy? Or you have an election, which is what the Constitution prescribes, in which case, where's your one nation, one election calendar? It's the feasibility that I'm worried about. I love the idea in principle. I just think in practice, in a parliamentary system, it cannot work. We'll again be back to the same mess we are in now in another 20, 30 years.
Yeah, actually, can I just respond to that, Shashi? When the Constitution was framed, as I said, the Constitution is not framed on the postulate that asymmetrical elections to Parliament and the state legislatures are part of the basic structure. In fact, as we know initially, we did have elections which were, to Parliament and the state legislatures which were held at the same time. It's when the new states came into being that, the problem really arose after the States Reorganization Act started coming into force. Now, the provision for, truncated elections initially is a transitional provision. So that once you've brought Parliament and the state legislatures in conformity after the first elections after the notified date, thereafter all elections to Parliament and the state legislatures would be held at one and the same time. What happens is, as Shashi said, what happens when, say, a state legislature is dissolved and elections are held prematurely? At that point, the voters are informed in advance that the next round of elections which would be held would be for the period which remained for the remainder of the term of that state legislature. The difficulty would have been if after elections are held, the term of that legislature is truncated. Now, in a parliamentary form of democracy, after elections are held, the term can always be truncated where the government loses its majority and the chief minister, or in the case in the union government, the prime minister and the cabinet, the council of ministers, recommend dissolution. But the one nation, one election, the proposed constitutional amendment does not do that. What it does is, as a part of the transitional arrangement, it postulates that the first elections for the remainder of the period would be for the conformity to be brought about both at the national and the state level. Thereafter, you will have the cycle of the same election taking place for Parliament and the state legislatures. The basic question that we have to ask ourselves is this: can the country afford the luxury of the country being constantly in a state of elections? Model code of conduct all over the country. No serious work of governance being done in some state or the other constantly because they are in an election mode. I don't think we can afford that luxury. We have to focus on development as opposed to just being constantly in a state of electoral politics. That's my concern, really.
No, I don't disagree with that. I just don't know how it's going to work in practice. That's not.
My next question to Dr. Tharoor, and I have to do this. The next Vice President of India, what comes to your mind?
No idea. I think some people tell me it might be Chandrachud. I don't know. Honestly, there's no clue. The government has given no one any clue as to what's happening. But the fact is that it will be somebody nominated by the ruling party because they have a comfortable majority. Unlike the president, where all the state assemblies also vote. For the vice president, it's just the two houses of parliament. So you already know who has the majority, and it's very much the ruling party.
Justice, the first word that comes to your mind when I say youth.
The hope and future of the nation.
Dr. Tharoor, when I say India.
My motherland, I love it. It belongs to me and I belong to it.
And Justice, when I say IIMUN.
International, yet truly Indian.
Hey! Wonderful. Have you got a potential politician sitting right here? He knows what to say.
Been an incredibly extraordinary conversation to be able to listen to two of the finest minds of our time. It's been nothing short of inspiring. And as someone who stumbled upon law, not knowing where it's going to lead, moderating this exchange has been the greatest honor of my life. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anjali.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It's a great experience, brilliant afternoon, really.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, Shashi, for writing
Thank
this
you
book
for
making
gracing this
possible.
occasion with your presence. It's been a great honor.
And now to close this conversation, I'd like to call upon the person who's made this possible. He's the reason we are here today. He built this platform from the ground up and created space for young people like me who were terrified of mic and still be terrified but have the guts to come up on stage and interview these fine men. He's our mentor, our biggest cheerleader, and the calm in the middle of every storm. Rishabh, I just want to say thank you from all of us, and it's my honor to invite you to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you. Hi, thanks. I don't know. Song is unnecessary for me. Did you guys like the conversation? Balcony, no noise? Both these gentlemen together for the very first time. Can we hear it once for them, please? I am delighted that we were able to do our small bit in getting the two of them together. Usually I'm used to talking to people who are below the age of 19, and therefore I speak what comes to my heart and then I just say it. But often I'm told saying you should think and then speak, and not speak and then think. And therefore I've written something in the form of a vote of thanks. Please bear with me as I read it out. It's also inspired by a gentleman who I was sitting next to because he says everything in verse. So I've tried to put things down in verse. If India were a case, we are still mid-trial, with altercations ongoing and new evidence on Pax Indica's fate surfacing steadily as time rewinds and ideologies debate. But today we heard from the voices who orchestrate where the case would go. One wields the gavel and the other the pen, and in this conversation, both reminded us time and again that the battle of belonging might still be underway, but when in doubt, the Constitution leads the way. It isn't a relic of the past, it's a living promise built to last. From striking down bonds that rigged the game, to acknowledging the right to love without shame. From saluting our soldiers in Operation Sindoor, to calling out the emergency with integrity pure. In a country that both needs and sees law and order, where every second person thinks they're Harvey Specter or Mike Ross, I'm always pleasantly discombobulated whenever I see power, intellect, and humility coincide, and rise above self, not for applause or thirst, but to deliver one narrative, that the nation comes first. And to see these giants for the first time walk together side by side at this organization fills my heart with gratitude deep from inside. They could have chosen any platform, any media stage, but they chose a non-profit that brings together every school and college under one page. And that, my friends, is enough evidence of the unflinching belief that they have that you are the generation that will make this a Viksit nation. First, to Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, thank you for accepting our invite and for always being the nation's guiding light, for letting women into Sabrimala with grace, and for ensuring privacy too found its rightful place. You honored autonomy, upheld dignity, stood tall, And for anyone still wondering, why am I a Hindu? You restored land and allotted space to every faith for one and for all. When the minority shrinks and the unheard plead, your court became refuge for the most in need, for those most in need. Today again was a masterclass in law, irreverently intellectual, yet profoundly raw. May your egalitarian worldview show us the way as we soon enter 15 years of nurturing tomorrow's leaders today. Thank you, sir. And now to a gentleman whose name does ignite not just identity, but ideation's light. A mentor, a wonderland of words, as Anjani said, whose resolute conviction outlasts headlines and hurts. With over a decade of service, both quiet and grand, he's lent us his wisdom, his heart, and his hand. To the chairperson of our advisory board, my sincerest gratitude. A man whose erudition and empathy blaze, where intellect dazzles and values reside. He walks not with pride, prejudice, or punditry, but with conscience as his guide. When he first met me, believe it or not, I was half my size. And I was ambivalent, incoherent between articulation and rise. And to be honest, I still am. I don't know what he saw, but with sagacious resolve and a $5 million smile, he lent me his grace and helped build a model UN into a movement to unite nations that has now produced various elected leaders for the land. His words, like Article 32 in might, protect what's just in democracy's fight, not merely by statute or legal decree, but as a moral compass when hearts cease to see. So thank you, sirs, to the both of you, for letting a young, small-town female lawyer from Ranchi, who is as IIMUN as one can be, hold the gavel as this literary hearing began to unravel. Not just to launch a book, but to launch a thought that the Constitution must be lived and not just taught. Now to the lawyers, the law students, the utopian doers, and the pragmatic dreamers in today's court. Know that this book isn't just academic sport. It is Exhibit A in the case for who we are, and prima facie proof that India will go far. Read it, not just for the citations or exams, but to grasp the journey of India from midnight to this millennium. For liberty isn't inherited, it's litigated each day, and democracy survives when we find the way. So, before I rest my case today, let me say, if life were a test match we play, not just the India versus England one, which I'm sure all of us are watching, and the world was watching from every stand, then these two men would be India's opening pair. Calm under pressure, steady and wise. Calm under pressure, steady and wise, leaving the bouncers, timing the drives. And with this engaging colloquy as your guidebook and spark, let this idea of India light your path. Through every era of darkness or gremlin in your way, because I believe the Constitution isn't just something to obey. It's something to live every single day. With that, let's call it, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, as it is, end of day's play. May I now request somebody who's, like I said, who's inspired me to write this in verse, to come up and to felicitate the two gentlemen. Dr. Nadir Godrej, if you can come up, please, and do the honors.